Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Today, we're going to look at the contracted versions of there is and there are, as well as there has been and there have been. Okay? Because the use of these can be a little bit confusing. Let's begin with there is and there are. So first of all, in written English, there is a dog in the garden. There are two dogs in the garden. In this case, the meaning and the writing is absolutely clear. There is and there are. There is when it's one dog. There are when there are many dogs. Okay, so it's very clear. Dogs in the second one is plural. However, when we use contractions, which we are required to do when we're speaking, there is becomes theirs, and there are becomes therer. Okay? But the reality is, in English, we use theirs for both singular and plural. There's a dog in the garden. There's two dogs in the garden. Now, the reason why we use the plural with the contraction of there is simply something of history. I don't know exactly why we do it, but we do. Now, some people do use there are two dogs in the garden. It's not wrong, but what you will hear mostly is there is, there's. Now, as you know, we don't usually write contractions unless it's some kind of reported speech or maybe in a novel where they're reporting what someone has said. But more often than not, theirs covers the singular and the plural. So I would say you hear both. There is a dog in the garden, contracted to there's a dog in the garden. There's two dogs in the garden. But in writing, it is correct to say there are two dogs. Okay. Now, I know it sounds a little bit confusing because there's no real rule for this. There's no rule as to why. But generally speaking, if you have a sentence where there isn't a clear subject, such as in the passive voice, then you would use the singular. Let me just give you some more examples of that to make it clearer. There's a dog in the garden. There's things in the garden which need to be moved by me. There's two police officers searching that house across the road. There's new neighbors moving in to the apartment next door. Now, when you do this, when you use theirs, it sounds perfectly fine. When you use there are new neighbors moving in next door, it sounds a little bit clunky. It's okay to use, but it's not quite as smooth. So, just to recap, when you write, you must choose is or are based upon the plural or singular. There are new neighbors moving in next door. But in the contraction, there's new neighbors moving in next door. So in the contraction, there's is much more common. There are, the contracted there are, is fairly common, but it's a little bit clunky. It's harder to say in the mouth, and you're not going to hear it that much, but it's not wrong. So if you are writing contractions, remember, it's usually the singular, and if you're writing anything formal, there is and there are, according to the rules, with the singular and plural. Now, what about there has been and there have been. In this case, in a contraction, we always use there's, and there's no exceptions to that. There's been 2 dogs in my garden for over an hour now. There's been crime happening in this street. There's 2 cats across the road is another example of there is. But if we stay with there has been just for a moment, there's been accidents on this street for the last 2 weeks. There's been engineering works on the road for some days now. Now, in this case, we can't use there have been, there have been. It just sounds wrong. And if you try to say it, you can probably hear that it just doesn't sound right. And if we look at the writing, there have been, you can hear it just doesn't sound okay. For example, if I say, there's been 2 candles at that window for 3 days now. If I say, there have been 2 candles at that window for 3 days now, you can hear it just sounds, and it doesn't sound right because usually we don't write these kinds of constructions. Usually we just say them. If you want to write them, then it would come out as there have been 2 candles at that window for 3 days now, but there has been 2 candles at that window for 3 days now sounds much better. To avoid this scenario where writing there have been, where it sounds bad, people generally just use there has been. There has been. After all, there's no subject at the beginning of the sentence to say who's doing it, whether it's a they or an it. And that gives us a little bit more of an opportunity to use has. So in the case of there has been or there have been, there has been is much more common and it's usually written as has. Now, I don't want to tell you that you're never going to see there have been, because you will. But it's one of these things which linguists argue about, whether we should use have or has been. Now, as I'm often telling you, unlike other countries in the world, English is not regulated. There's no big authority to say whether has been or have been is right. Over time, things change. And as they change, they're recorded by linguists and they'll end up as examples in the Oxford or Cambridge Dictionary. So you can see that we have to watch English changing, and sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable because we want rules, what's right and what isn't. And it's not always as straightforward as you might think. So let me just clarify a little bit, just to recap on what we've spoken about. There is and there are, both in writing, are used in the way that you probably already know. There is a dog, there are 2 dogs. But in contractions in speech, it usually becomes there's 2 dogs in the garden. To say there are 2 dogs in the garden is kind of new and clunky. It's a bit politically correct and forced, but it's not wrong. In the case of there has been and there have been, there have just doesn't sound right ever. So you're going to hear there has been more. There has been accidents on this street for 2 years now, for example. Okay, so you need to be a little bit more careful with this. Go for there has, because in writing there have, it just sounds horrible. But you are going to see it, particularly in American English, because they're not very good with the present perfect. They don't like to use it. And when they do, they usually use it incorrectly, according to British rules. All right. So when it comes to there has and there have, there has is almost certainly more right. And I would encourage you to use that as much as you can. But if you see there have, a little voice will probably ring inside and say, ooh, that doesn't sound right. So there has is always the way that I would tell you to write something. So in contractions and in speaking, it's going to be there's for there's two dogs in the garden. And again, there's for been. There's been accidents on this street for a long time. Okay, so there's as a contraction is what we're focusing in on in speaking. And there's takes priority. There are, you hear it, but it's a bit clunky. It's a bit harder to say. And because of that, it's not so common. I hope you found this helpful, all right? So remember, theirs is much more common, but you can use both if you want, all right? It's not wrong, but contractions need to be used in speech. So if you are someone who doesn't use contractions, I really recommend that you go over to Enchanted Learning. If you just put into Google Enchanted Learning contractions, use those keywords, Enchanted Learning contractions, you'll find a whole list of them and you can go through them there. I hope you found this helpful. See you. Bye.